Morning, Kindlech. Here to, God willing, go weiter in the Maimer of Baruch Sheasah Nissim. As always, learning to bind ourselves to God. Pleasure to God, hasten redemption. We're starting in Os Gimel, actually the second paragraph, talking about the difference between Chochmah and Bina, and that the world in its normal functioning comes from an external fusion of Chochmah and Bina, and in the miraculous functioning comes from an internal fusion. And the general difference between the everyday running of the world is God reckons what every creature needs, its special little content and personality, and gives it exactly according to how that creation was put together. Make sure I get chocolate, and you get pizza, and this one gets whatever she needs, and on and on. And the external fusion is constant, the internal fusion takes effort. We haven't described the effort. And that Chochmah is characterized by a feeling of all that there is God. Bina has a knowledge of all that there is God, but not so much the feeling. The feeling by Bina, even when being aware of the idea that all there is God, is more a feeling of self, that that person is aware of that. Anyway, okay, so paragraph base. V'hinei shebabina hu das taktun shel ma'ala ein u'lamata yesh. And this, that Bina is a lower way of knowledge, the way we see things, that we see multiplicity in the world. And it looks as if the world exists and God's a bit abstract. It also relates to how Chochmah gives over its flow to Bina. Let's see. The Chochmah Bina Heim Ayin V'yesh, because you could say Chochmah and Bina are Ayin Yesh. Alright, so Bina's view of the world is the world exists and God's this infinite capacity beyond. And Chochmah's view is that God exists in the world, some insignificant entity that's just absorbed in godliness. Chochmah says God's the real thing, and Bina says, it looks like there's a world, I know there's God, but I gotta kind of think into it. So, a little bit opposite that way. So we're saying, for purposes of this discussion, Chochmah is ayin, nothing, and Bina is yesh. Chochmah's beyond, and Bina's here. It's here with us, plain earth. And when Chochmah gives life to Bina, it's similar to a yesh mi'ayin process. See how that works. And like when God creates something from nothing, the nothingness is hidden from the something. We're all here. We all know God is making us and enlivening us every second. But as far as I know, none of us see it. I haven't met anyone who will tell me that they see God enlivening them every second. Could be. Shalochein nikra b'shem ayin lefi she'enu musag b'yesh v'zeh she'ayin enu musag b'yesh v'lo rak mitzad ha'yesh shehu bein aruch la'ayin v'ochen ein v'chol ha'lasig es ayin elagam mitzad ha'ayin shehu ha'ayin salam ha'yesh. Alright, can't tell you I know exactly what that means, but it's an interesting idea. This, that the creative force is hidden from the creative entity, that we can't necessarily see God enlivening us every second, and that's why we call it ayin, nothing, because we can't see it, we can't perceive it. I mean, you can, well, whatever, maybe you could intuit it, maybe you could reason into it, you could think it, but to have a palpable appreciation of it, like, picking up this book that's in front of me, it's a little different. Okay, so the fact that we call it ayin isn't only because we can't really grasp God, we can't grasp that He's created, we can't have it on our terms, wrap it around in our head and our heart in our terms that God's enlivening us every second. But that's not the only reason that we call the creative force ayin. We also call it ayin because of just one thing is we don't really get it. It's just so far beyond us. But that's not the full reason for this name ayin. Somehow it also stems from just some attributes of how God is Himself, from just regardless of what God makes, just the fact that God is God. He could acquire this title of ayin, or not that He could, God can do whatever He wants, but this title ayin would apply to Him because He's hidden from us. So I don't know exactly what that means. You could argue God's hidden because we don't really get it. He's beyond us, and it's that we're just saying two ways of the same thing. But it seems like, maybe it'll say soon in the paragraph, but it seems like there's an intentional hiddenness here, more than just, hey, something's beyond us because, there's this thing, and it happens to be totally beyond us. So it seems like there's some intent, but let's see if it's if it explains. Trevor will explain. Looks like he's going to. And it's well known that this creation of something from nothing that comes from this godly force that enlivens a creation, it's hidden from the creation. Al derek zeh hu v'zhavas bina v'chachma. So too when it comes to chachma and bina, that when chachma enlivens bina, the the chachma is, so to speak, hidden from the bina. The zeh bina hi yesh lefi hu lefi she'en the chachma yisalam bina. This that bina is a yesh. It's because that the ayin of chachma is hidden from the bina. Chachma does give a lot to bina, but it holds that feeling that it has of godliness. It kind of keeps to itself and holds back. But through that, it can enliven bina. And also, even though that bina does, it seems odd to say the chachma is hidden from bina. You know, bina is, it only, everything in bina was once in chachma. Bina is just an expansion of chachma. So how are you going to tell me that there's part of chachma that's not getting it? It seems like bina is dissecting chachma into a million different pieces and almost getting chachma better than chachma gets chachma. So this, that bina does grasp into chachma. Bina misagas nekudas haskala. It understands the intellectual part. So bina can wrap its head around the intellectual parts of chachma. What chachma's really all about is this spiritual sight it has, a way it can see, which is much higher than intellect. That's what generally characterizes chachma. Certain, call it intellectual perception, intuitive perception, spiritual perception, certain palpable perception that it could have, how a person could feel that he feels godliness. And bina is more the intellectual aspect. The inyan zeh eina nimshach klal bina, and this idea of Riya de Chachma, this idea that Chachma has this ability to perceive godliness, that's not passed into bina. You can only pass the intellectual part into bina. So he has to do that. And also even the intellectual part that goes into bina, it's mainly hanachas nefesh. Try to think of a term for that in a minute here. A sekel shabahu raketsonius, and the sekel, the intellectual part, is just the external aspect of that. Shachah from chachma. Masha musag bina hu rak sekel from nekudas haskalas tzonius avon. And this that bina gets, it's just the intellectual part from the outer part of the nekuda. So first of all, it's dealing with the intellectual part, which is already a lower degree of chachma, and even within the intellect, it's dealing with the outermost part of that. But the hanacha that's within the nekuda of this piece of intellect, its most inner and essential point, even that is hidden in regards to bina. It doesn't get it. Alright, so we need a good taich for this word hanacha. Hanacha means to place. Bina gets something, gives you an intellectual appreciation of where to put something in your soul that it fits into. You know, a human being is made up of many parts: pleasure, will, intellect, emotion, thought, speech, deed, action, of course. But a person, let's say they have a certain intellectual framework, and then they come to understand something new, then they fit it into their framework, and then they have some, we'll call it global body of knowledge there that becomes their intellect. They just incorporated some new piece of knowledge into the general force called their intellect. When that incorporation is hanachas nefesh, from what I understand. I hope that's what it is anyway. So bina takes the new wisdom that Chachma brought into your little spiritual universe and places it somewhere in your soul that it fits nice. But even this that it understands, it's just the outermost part of whatever that intellectual idea is. But the most innermost point of that intellect, she never is able to place. Bina is unable to place in the soul. It stays hidden. Let's see if I can think of an example of the innermost point of a certain piece of wisdom. Let's say Ein Od Milvado. Let's see if we can that out. So Chachma feels it and it tries to pass it on to Bina. Bina can't really totally get her head around the idea of Ein Od Milvado, but she can talk about the ideas that all there is God. And we'll have to figure out a way to break this intellect into its innermost point. Even on the lower level of Chochmah, which we're calling it, but for the purpose of this mimer, is intellect, even the innermost point of that intellect can't be grasped by Bina, even though Bina generally does grasp intellect, but the intellect she does grasp is only the outer part. So according to this, we can explain how Das Elyon, how God sees things, for a simple explanation, is primarily in Chochmah, that all there is God. Mashen came for Bina, not so for Bina, after Bina Masugin Haninin Shel Chochmah, even though Bina does understand these concepts, who Das Takton, she's still Das Takton, the lower level, where what's emphasized is perception of self, of creation. He says who Das Elyon Shalamata Ayin Ahergash Kulukum Lachashiv, who Lo Mitzada Segal Shabbat, Shahari Asegel who Mitzias, Hefak Ahergash Kulachashiv, Ela Mitzada Panimus Atzmi Shalah, Shavus Rita Hachmash Laman Segal. We keep in this Ejanim Shek Babina, who Raka Skala Hachma, Lokin Babina, who Das Takton. So, putting some similar to what we said already, but putting a mechanism to it, a little more detail. So this, that Chochmah has a feeling that God's the only thing that exists and nothing else has any importance, it doesn't come from its intellectual aspect, because intellect is a mitzias, a creation, a thing, where now you have duplicity, multiplicity, you have God and something else, you're emphasizing the something else, the lower part of the world, we're emphasizing God, all that there is God, there's nothing else to talk about. And this is the opposite of nothing has importance. If what's front and center in my mind is the idea that nothing compares to God, then what's being emphasized at that time is the idea and not God. So it's sort of the opposite of that nothing has any importance, because I could be very wrapped up in that idea. I could think the idea is important. But Chochmah, nothing is important. No idea is nothing. All there is, I don't care what you ever think. You could have the greatest thought ever. It doesn't compare to God. But it does, so this idea that Chochmah gets that nothing compares to God, it's not from its intellectual aspect, it's from its innermost and essential aspect, which we're going to call the Riyah Chochmah. A person can perceive things without really reasoning, intuiting, and thinking. Sometimes you can just see something in your mind. You could sense it. I'm not explain it. You're learning a Gemara and you see it. And you're at that point where you couldn't really explain it to anybody yet. A certain perception. I want to say it's not an intellectual perception. It is, but it's different. It's not reasoned out. It's just a certain feeling. You just get it. It just resonates in your soul somehow. Anyway, there's a certain intellectual perception that Chochmah has, and it's from this type of perception, which we're calling a certain vision, its ability to see, that gives Chochmah this sense that nothing compares to God, which is completely higher than its intellectual aspect, and all that gets passed on to Bina is the intellectual aspect, so that's why Bina is emphasized by intellect, Yesh Mitzias, and Chochmah is emphasized a little bit more by Ayin. Bina is Eshabina Nimshak Raka Segal Chochmah Shalokin Bina who Das Takton, who Bakatsini is Bina. But this that we're kind of putting Bina down a little bit, this that she only gets the intellectual aspect from Chochmah, and we're calling her Das Takton, that's just her external aspect. Her external parts can only wrap her head around the intellectual points of Chochmah. This that Bina only gets the lower part of Chochmah, not only the lower part, the external part of the lower part. This way that we're limiting Bina, it's only true of the external aspects of Bina. Abu Panemius Bina me'ir etzma Chochmah, but in the inner part of Bina shines the etzma Chochmah. So even Bina can go up to Das Elyon. She can also feel this idea that nothing compares to God. So this we can understand from the internal union of Chochmah and Bina is drawn down miracles. Because miraculous stuff corresponds to Das Elyon, our perception of only God. Bina, this and this, when they fuse Chochmah and Bina in an internal way, there's Gamba Bina idea, then even she can feel that nothing compares to God. And the conduct that's drawn down from this union is a miraculous conduct. You can put that together. So in a general way of speaking, Chochmah gives to Bina in the external way, then she's just getting seichel and the outermost part of the seichel, and that's the outermost part of her. But if they give in a very inner way, then she can get it all. She can get this whole feeling of everything good. I'm trying to think what this would mean in terms, that's end of Os Gimel, in terms of two human beings. So Chachma is generally male, being is female. So let's say a male is explaining some idea in Torah to a female, just to make it simple. If he's giving over the intellectual points, then that's what she'll get. If he's trying to explain a feeling inside, trying to picture what the difference in the two discussions would be. How do you have one discussion about a point that generates an external fusion, and how do you have a discussion about the same point that will generate an internal fusion? Whether you're speaking to your mind, her mind, or speaking to her heart. Food for thought. Something to think about. Alright, we got to hold here. Everyone have a great day. Mashiach now. We should have everything you need. And Gashmis and Ruknias, kids, cash, shirts, a lot of money, happiness, simchas, nachas, everything good. And Mashiach now.